Hey everybody, it is Friday evening and we are going to take a trip around the world, so buckle up because we got a lot to cover tonight. So starting here with my waterfall tank, I've made a few additions to it. I've done a little bit of maintenance to it, and there's some stuff we're probably going to be needing to do to it in the very near future. So the additions are a bird's nest fern, which I had never seen before today. I don't know if that's going to be too much light for it or not. I guess we're going to find out. This is an artificial light, so it's not like I'm putting it out in direct sunlight, but it's a really serious artificial light. So, you know, where I purchased it at the garden center, it was definitely in a shady area. It was on one of the tables under the big trees, so that's generally where they put their shade plants. So I don't know how well that's going to transition to just being under full light all day. I may actually give it reduced days for a few days to see if it, sort of adjusts to the full sun like this. So we'll see how that plays out. But the other addition is this caladium, and I don't know how long that's going to stay there where it is, because we actually deliberately bought this particular caladium because we can get in there and divide that up and get lots and lots of caladium to put out in the yard. So for the time being, it'll be in here, but that might get divided up, and I might wind up putting a small chunk of that where the fern is, and we can put the fern out in the garden or something. I don't know. But those are my two new additions. I also moved some other stuff around. This Rex begonia here was back in this position, sort of covering kind of that ugly, not really much going on back there area. But that is now been moved up front. I also took my other Rex begonia and put that over here. So the geranium that's all the way down there, I don't know if that's going to be enough light for it. It's right on the periphery, and that's about 5 or 6 feet away from the light itself. So I don't know how well that's going to do. But it was sitting up here, and I went ahead and pulled it down because it was actually getting so tall that we were starting to get a little bit of damage on some of the leaves. You can see there, that was actually because it was so tall. It was actually too much in the light out here. So I moved it down, and hopefully that will alleviate that problem. We'll see how that goes. And then of course I moved this one over here, and it's got room to grow. My dead nettles are doing really well. They're growing down and through and everywhere, so that looks good. And then I got lots of growth going on over on this side, but it's the duckweed that kills me. I was in here after my water change today, and I was scooping duckweed out of the tank. Here, let me turn this light on. I always forget to do that before the video start. So I was down here scooping duckweed out of the tank, and then it occurred to me that I'm wasting my time, because no matter how much duckweed I pull out of the tank, I've still got all of that duckweed growing in there. I've got duckweed growing all through here. The duckweed growing in there is actually backing the water up to the point where it's dripping over. I've got duckweed growing on the sides. Got duckweed growing across the front of it. Duckweed is tenacious. Think long and hard before you add duckweed to your aquarium. If you're thinking about putting a plant or a floating plant or something, really seriously think long and hard about putting duckweed in your aquarium. Now, I'm not too worried about it, but it is regular maintenance. I am in here regularly pulling duckweed off the surface of my tanks, a lot of my tanks, as we'll see as we go around the room. As far as the tank goes, I got in there and I did a big water change. I changed the filter in the pump. I changed the filter in the hang on the back. I wiped the glass down, and because this tank has very little capacity for removing its mulm and whatnot on its own, I always get into this tank and do not necessarily a gravel vac in the sense where I'm scrunching down into the gravel and disturbing the gravel beds. I don't know if this tank really counts as having a gravel bed per se, but I really don't, do that a whole lot, because you can see where there's rocks everywhere. I can't really get to the gravel except in a few select places up front here, but I can remove all of the big piles of crud that develop in the corners and the nooks and the crannies, and you can see I got in there and did a lot of that. I removed a bunch of crud out of this tank today, and I got the water looking nice and clear again. I removed a bunch of tannins. We did about a 50% water change. It was looking really good. Unfortunately, because I've got it so full now, we're up to the level of the hang on the back filter, which gives me this really sort of vigorous flow across the front and takes my Ludwigia and slams it up against the side there. But you can see all the roots and the little trailers coming off of them. When the water gets a little bit lower, the surface gets a lot calmer, and that will actually sort of spread out and grow across the surface, and I don't really need the floating water sprite in this tank. I can let that Ludwigia do its thing, and then of course the Java fern in there is growing really well and looking good, so I'm happy about that. I've even got a little bit of growth on my temple plant down there. I thought it kind of died off. You can see the dead branches in there that are still just sitting there, but that little bit of growth is brand new, and so maybe we'll get a new temple plant growing up and out of the tank and looking good. I'd be really interested to see how big we could get a temple plant coming out of there. As far as my foot tank goes, nothing really to talk about in this one. I need to get in there and get some of the duckweed out of this tank. You can see the nice coverage I'm growing across the top of it. I did remove a few fish and a shrimp from this tank recently. I put them in my office tank, and I also got in there and pulled a bunch of water sprite out. I had a viewer wanted to buy some water sprite from me, so my email is down below if you're interested in purchasing any plants. And so I actually took some plants out of this tank, some water sprite, and I did my best. I hope I got all of the duckweed off of it. I rinsed it out in another bucket and held it underwater long enough to let all the duckweed float to the top and all that sort of stuff. But I did remove a bunch of water sprite out of that tank, and that is why we can actually see some of the surface of the water now. So let's power this tank down, or at least shut all the lights off for the time being, and that way we won't have a huge glare on everything else as we go around the room. And then we will come over here and we will get to my 29 miscellaneous. Now I got stuff all over the floor, so I'm going to have to be careful not to trip and kill myself here. Pretty big water change today. Filter change, of course. I always do the filter change on this one. It's a simple hang on the back filter. There's no reason not to just swap the pads out real quick. That's no big deal. I pulled a little bit of cyanobacteria mats, you know, that funky green stuff that you get growing on the top sides of some of the leaves there. I pulled a few dead fronds out of there from the water, I'm calling it water sprite, the Java fern. And that's really about it. Not a lot going on. This is one of my tanks that just ticks over like a clock. I had someone tell me recently that if you don't set a tank up with the proper layers of, you know, real earth and, you know, do a full-blown dirted tank, then you'll never have a tank that stays stable for more than 3 years. And this tank's probably pushing 8 years now, at least 7 of completely stable. This is my most stable tank I've got, and it doesn't even have like planted gravel, you know, or planted substrate in it. It's got that fake gravel. I've got a little bit of the colored stuff mixed in with it, but that is because that's how it came. It was those bags of gravel that was mostly black, but it had specks of other colors in it too. And if you actually look at that stuff closely, what it is, it's like a hard EVA foam, or it's like a hard dense foam, and then it's just painted whatever color they want to paint it. So I got the stuff that was mostly painted black, but that's not even real gravel, it's plastic. And so, you know, with plastic substrate in the tank and all these plants and everything, I've got stability like I've got in no other tank anywhere, and it's been going on for at least 7 years. If you look at this Java fern, now this Java fern hasn't been in here growing on this rock for 7 years, but if you look at that Java fern and the way it's spreading its roots out across that rock and just attaching to it and growing to it, I'm afraid to do anything to that one because I don't want to mess up that, you know, attachment like that. That's been years in the making, so I'm going to leave that one well enough alone. But I don't buy the you can't have a stable tank for more than 3 years. Now, you can't have a stable tank if you don't do proper maintenance to it for any length of time. As long as you maintain your tank, I don't see why I can't run this tank like this indefinitely. So there you go. That's my most stable tank, 29 miscellaneous. Moving on to my Gourami tank. This tank, once upon a time, was my problem tank too. When I first got started, I went round and round, always having issues with this tank, and eventually The thing I wound up doing that was probably most helpful in sorting out the issues was I stopped messing with it constantly and sort of let it stabilize and let it work itself out, and eventually it did. And now this is also one of my more stable tanks. I do get that red cyanobacteria that slowly develops and builds up in here, but that's one of those things that, you know, again, every 9 months I have to do a little cyanobacteria treatment with the Ultralife for the ChemiClean, one or the other. They both work about the same. And, you know, whatever. Again, I don't even consider that to be an issue. So this, again, is one of my more stable tanks. And nothing really to talk about in here. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because we've got a lot to cover in some of my other tanks. So my red-tailed loach is still in there. I saw him sticking his tail out the other night, so he's still alive and well. My dojo loaches that are in there are still alive and doing well. And my little zebra loach, which of course I don't see when I'm shooting video of this tank, a little tiny thing. It's growing really, really slowly. I'm surprised how small it still is. But somewhere in there is my little teeny tiny sort of black and gold or black and white zebra loach. And again, it's doing really well and looking good. It gets down there and shuffles with the best of them, and it eats with everybody else. So it's definitely not intimidated by anybody. I was kind of worried my big fat Raphael catfish down here might eat it when I first got it, but so far so good. And I don't see it, so we're going to move on. It's in there somewhere, or at least it was as of yesterday. So my 55-gallon tank here, not much to talk about in here except my Anubias once again is just starting to grow out of control. It's been in here so long now. These plants are, I don't know, 6 years old, maybe pushing 7 years old. This again is one of my earlier tanks as well, and it almost looks like the part down here at the bottom is died off, and then the rhizome up here is what's still growing. But I have these huge masses of rhizomes growing through here, and I'm really going to need to just get in there and cut them back again. I'm growing all the way up to the top. I'm getting new growth coming out on them constantly. This one's the same way. I'm getting all this new vigorous growth coming out of the top, and it likewise is just this huge mass. So this is one of those tanks that's just kind of weird looking to me. It's got two massive Anubias plants in it that I'll grant you do need some maintenance. This tank's one that I've not done any maintenance to today. We're going to see what I've done to a few other tanks, but this is not one I've done anything to. And at the very least, I need to get in there and pull some of those dead yellowing leaves out of there, get them cleaned out. That, of course, is my big pleco on the bottom. You can see my diamond tetras in there doing their beautiful, gorgeous diamond tetra thing. But otherwise, not a lot to talk about. Haven't even done a water change on this tank in, I don't know, a couple of weeks. Probably at least 10 days, 2 weeks maybe. It's not too much poop building up, so it hasn't been that terribly long since I've done a water change on it. But we need to wipe the glass down too, because you can see that red cyanobacteria is building up on the glass in this tank a little bit too, so getting in there and wiping the glass down wouldn't hurt. My 40 breeder. Nothing really going on in this one other than I'm starting to hear an annoying rattle in the Sun canister filter. Now, this tank has a... Oh, you know what? This tank has a 304B on it too. I used to have a 303B, which is a smaller one. But apparently I switched it over and put the 304B on this. So I do have the same Sun canister filter. Now, I would put a simple hang on the back filter on this, except when I built my fish room way back in the day, I did not have a giant 6-foot tank standing here to my left, and what I did have was this bench came down and then came across at like a 45-degree angle, and my 40 tank was this way, which gave it some room in the back, and I did have a hang on the back filter on it. And then right here we had a little 20-gallon tank, and that was the end of my fish room. And so when I bought this big 6-foot tank, I had to knock this corner off and basically just flatten it against the wall, which is what I did. And when I did that, I mean, you can see where I could barely squeeze these hoses against it, you know, between it and the wall. I can barely get them in for the spray bar and the intake, and yet we are, you know, we're sitting right on the edge. My other tanks are, you know, away from the edge a little bit, so there's not much else I can do except have the canister filter on this, unless I were to take the top off and put a hang on the back on the side here flowing this way, and then I'd have an open top tank. And I've considered that. I do like this idea of making this an open top tank, but not right now. As far as what's going on in the tank, not a lot to talk about, not a lot of change really. Again, that rattling filter is the only thing that I think about whenever I look at this tank. We're pretty much down to my last rainbow fish, which is right there. I'm considering getting in there and capturing it and putting it in my 125 with my other rainbow fish, just because it's a lone rainbow fish in there doing its thing by itself, so why not? My Crenocycla regani, of course, is doing well. She's awesome. And the bubbles in this tank are kind of annoying. They get stuck all over everything, and they leave little whatevers on everything. But I feel a lot more comfortable knowing I've got that bubbler going on in the tank. When I used to have it the way I did, I was always afraid that this tank was going to be low on oxygen, and now that I've got that air stone in there, I just feel a lot more comfortable. So moving on to my New World tank. This is what started my day today, and this is probably going to be the most shocking revelation for everybody in there. If you are a regular viewer, you will notice that my new woodwork down on the left side of the tank looks completely different than it did. And that is because I actually got in here and moved this piece of wood all around. And it was a nightmare. It was a royal pain in the butt. Not going to go into a ton of detail right now. I'll save that for a video where I just talk about what I did to this particular piece of wood. But that's what got started today. I was doing a water change, and I thought while I was in here, you know what, I'm going to move that piece of wood. And it's easy to think that, but actually getting that enormous piece of wood into that position was a bit of a challenge. For one thing, you can see that's literally jammed against the glass so hard that they're broken and bent against the glass. At one point, even with my headphones on and the music playing, I heard a snap, and my heart skipped a beat. I thought I was pushing down, and I thought the bottom of the tank cracked when I heard the snap, and what it turned out to be was this piece of wood actually broke. I was trying to force it under this so hard that it broke. So you can see, maybe you can see all that wood scraped up against it where I was shoving it and jamming it under there. And then we are jammed against the back of the glass as well. I mean, it's pressing up against that glass. So that's how it's going to stay for a while. I'll be honest with you, I don't particularly like it. I thought it would be neat to try it. Once I got it in there, it was one of those like, all right, now that I'm done that, we're not doing that again. And so eventually it'll come out, maybe, I don't know. It might grow on me, you never know. You can't really even see all of this. That just gets hidden, you know, the horns, I guess you could say, from the stag's head sort of shaped. You know, got a lot of people saying it looked like a sort of a deer skull with the antlers and all that, and I can totally see it. But the way I've got it in there now, it just ruins that effect. You don't get any of that at all. But it's not bad. I mean, I don't dislike it either. It gives a lot of open space and swimming around area. I was able to establish the Anubias underneath of it, so you can actually still see the Anubias, and it gets plenty of light. You can actually look down in the top and see the Anubias in there. And of course, you get to see all of the interesting wood when you look at it from this angle. Now, of course, that'll be all covered in green growth and everything in a matter of a week or two. Just like you can see all that dark green that's growing. Those are all the surfaces that were facing upwards before I got in there and moved it around. And you can see how much green growth was really on that. So, I don't know. Like I said, that's I'm not crazy about it, but that's how it is now, and so since that's how it is, that's how it's going to be. That was a lot of work getting it in there, so it's going to stay that way, at least for a little while. And when I do get in there and pull it out, it's probably going to come out in pieces, to be honest with you. I'm probably not going to try to wriggle that thing out of there all intact without scraping anything. The fact that I got my water sprite to go back into position and stand back up the way it was after all of that manhandling and manipulating and everything I did is amazing. But I also cleared out a bunch of the new growth and all of the offspring and everything throughout all of that water sprite. So I really thinned that out a lot, which allowed for a lot more light to get through and opens the tank up. And I did about a 50% water change, which got a lot of tannins out of the tank. And that opens everything up and makes it look a lot more bright and cheery in there. No gravel vac in. I did wipe the glass down, but in a really rough and ready sort of way. Actually, you know what? I didn't even wipe the glass down on this tank, did I? No, I didn't even wipe the glass down on this tank. I was so sweating and hot and puffing and done by the time I got done wrestling with that piece of wood that I just filled it back up and we moved on and started working on some other tanks. So that was my big project for today, getting this one done. And then I moved on to my purple spotted gudgeon tank. Now, my regular viewers will notice that there's a big old open bright lit spot in the middle there. It's my gudgeon. He's not real happy about the events that have transpired today so far. He's laying low. So this tank really needed a water change. It had growth on the top of it. It was just really looking funky and unpleasant, and I'd really neglected it. It was just overdue for some serious maintenance. I had decided as soon as I started working on it that I was going to clean it up just enough to give it a chemi-clean treatment, which is what's happening. That's why you see those bubbles and the foam on the surface there. And you can see all of that thick green mats of stuff, all that cyanobacteria all over that. Look at that. So that's why I decided to go ahead and give it the chemi-clean treatment. But as I was in there vacuuming it out and moving everything around, all of the roots, I had a big temple plant in the middle and I cut it way back, and it was just so much roots in there that all of the roots, that's a big old sheet of cyanobacteria right there. It's already starting to break loose and come off of the leaves. The roots were all rotten, and the roots were actually getting sucked up in the gravel vac and starting to pull out of there. And so I spent a long time doing that, and I was using my siphon, so it was running right into the drain in the other room. It wasn't like I was limited to a 5-gallon bucket. I did about half the tank. And by the time I was about 50% down, I noticed that the whole mass was just sort of moving around. And I gave it a little tug and pulled it all up, and just the whole thing was just all rotten and came apart. And so this, we're beginning the cleanup on this tank. I really, I knew I was throwing the dice when I cut that temple plant back as drastically as I did. I brutalized it. I mean, I cut it way back. It was covered in aphids, and so I cut it down literally just below the water line. Anything above the water line got cut off, and it couldn't deal with it. It wasn't able to recover from that much manicuring, I'll call it. Whatever, it's dead. So now we're going to go ahead and get the tank cleaned up. The chemi-clean treatment will get a lot of this cyanobacteria and all that. You see that thick dark green stuff growing on the leaves and everything. We'll get a lot of that cleaned up and killed. I'm probably going to do a double treatment back to back. The stuff's cheap enough, easy enough. I've already got the air stone in there. Why not just do a second treatment on top of it just to make sure I wipe everything out, So that's what's going on with this tank. We are going to talk briefly about my 125 here because we got a lot to talk about with this tank, but that's going to be kind of its own videos here over the next coming couple of days. We're going to be talking about what's going on in these tanks, or in this tank rather. I say these tanks, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. Anyway, green water is because my red-tailed shark right there, my rainbow shark, I always call this a red-tailed shark for some reason. My rainbow shark had a little bit of a fungal infection, a little bit of fin rot going on, and so the API fungus cure, one of the medications in it is like malachite green or something like that. It's whatever it is. It turns your tank this really, really funky color green. and it works like a charm. The couple of times I've had to use it for what I believe to be fungal infections, it cleared them right up within a few days. And so today I got in there and did about a 30 or 40% water change. I'm going to be getting in here and doing more work, so I'm not really going to go crazy on the water change. Again, we're going to be talking more about this tank in its own right. And now that I'm looking in here, if you look at all of those little white things, those are all detritus worms swirling around. It's a lot of them. So hopefully the rainbow fish will gorge themselves on those little tiny things. And so that's exactly what I'm talking about. I got in here and I did a little tiny bit of disruption today when I did my water change, and just that little bit of disruption has already got these detritus worms going everywhere. And so what I need to do is get in there and really clean this tank up. I've just allowed the vegetation to get so thick that it's collecting detritus, it's reducing the amount of water flow, and it's just really getting this tank to the point where it's just dirty. You know, when you see detritus worms literally just swirling around in the water column, that's a sign of, you know, there's too much mulm, there's too much crud, there's too much uneaten food. I'm overfeeding, I'm under vacuuming, I'm, you know, maybe under, the filter change isn't so much an issue because it's the stuff that accumulates in the tank that is the issue. It's not how dirty the filter is, it's not the nitrate level, it's the physical stuff. It's the mulm, it's the crud, it's the uneaten food, it's the dead leaves, and you know, the parts of the plant in the middle that aren't growing right anymore and are starting to rot away in the tank. It's that kind of stuff physically in the tank that is becoming problematic. I'm starting to have issues. I'm getting fish with fungus infections. I'm now seeing these detritus worms right after doing this water change. I literally just finished the water change before I started this video, and I'm now seeing the detritus worms for the first time. So I didn't even notice them during the water change. So it just goes to show that, you know, what I'm talking about, I'm spot on. I really need to get in here and do some serious cleaning and maintenance. I know it's really hard to see. You see more glare and reflection than you do into the tank, but in that darkness in there is a big piece of wood that is concave, and, well, or convex, depending on which side you're looking at, I suppose. But it's a cavity underneath of it that can hold, you know, 6 buckets of fish bait can hide in that thing. It's a big gap that's probably got so much stuff in it that, you know, again, it's going to be its own video. I didn't really get to it today. I just did a water change to get started. You know, better get something done than nothing, and I wasn't going to allow the fact that, you know, I wasn't in the mood for shooting a video about it today. I wasn't going to let that stop me from getting some work done. So we did do some work today without getting it on video. But that's all I really did, was I did a big water change to start removing some of that medication. Tomorrow I'll get in there and I'll do another big water change, and we will start removing some plants. We're going to start lifting up some, you know, pieces of wood and getting in there and doing some really, really serious crud removal, and sort of rethinking the way I've been managing this tank. And hopefully that will get on top of, you know, the issues like the fungal infection on the shark. As far as the loaches, that's something different. We'll talk about that coming up. As far as my dead rainbow fish, my regular viewers know that I lost a few rainbow fish recently. We are going to talk about that as well in another video where we talk about just what's been going on in this tank in general. You know, I learned a lot today from just what we've discussed just now, seeing these detritus worms in there and everything. So again, we're going to talk about you know, my upkeep of this tank, what I've been doing to it, what I haven't been doing to it, and, you know, just discussing what's going on in this tank, because it really, I think it's worth talking about a little bit. Anyway, moving on to my 20-gallon angelfish tank. Speaking of fungal infections, if you look on the very tip of the caudal fin, the very bottom edge, you see that white fuzzy spot? I believe that to be a fungal infection. I've ordered some medication. I've already used all the medication in that tank. So tomorrow I'll be getting the meds for this tank. We're going to turn this tank green. But again, I think that it's no mystery why that fish has a little bit of a fungal infection on its tail. I mentioned this in a previous video, but for my viewers that only watch these around the world updates, and this is where you catch up on all the tanks, I got in there and I did a really good mulm removal. Again, the same thing, exactly what I was talking about in the last tank. It's just I've not been keeping up on the proper maintenance. I've been doing water changes, which gets the nitrates out. I know everybody gets hung up on making sure those nitrates don't get too high, but while I was doing my water changes and filter changes and keeping the nitrates low and everything, I was totally ignoring the fact that mulm and crud was just collecting on this side of the tank. And that's just, it's not good for a tank. It's got bacteria and just, oh, who knows what's in there. Obviously fungus. And it just opens your fish up to the possibility of having, you know, it's just dirty water swirling around. And then you have a little instance where I'm in there, you know, for example, yesterday, all that stuff is swirling around the tank. The fish are darting and dashing, trying to get away from me and my gravel vac. It's very likely that fish just got a little minor injury. And then with all that crud and bacteria and everything I was swirling around, you know, now, boom, we've got a little bit of a fungus infection or a little bit of an infected, you know, bacterial infection going on. So now we're going to be treating this tank for a fungal infection. But again, it's nobody's fault but mine for just being lax on the maintenance. That's what you get. So let that be a lesson. You know, you can learn from my mistakes. Don't do that. We're not going to look in my quarantine tank yet. It does have a fish in it, but we're not going to talk about it just yet. It is just about ready, I think, to come upstairs into my office tank and will be the new addition there. So look forward to that video coming up in the fairly near future. So wrapping it up by looking at Butterbean here. We just shot a video of him feasting on snails the other night. You can see I need to get in here and vac up a few of those dead snail shells. Pretty soon he's going to have a white bottom tank instead of the black gravel that I've got in there. It's going to look like it's going to be a white sandy beach pretty soon, but that's on all dead snail shells. Otherwise, everything's, you know, ticking over like a clock. Not any issues that I can think of. I probably should get in there and clear out a lot of the dead brown, you know, just again get in there and clear out some of the crud. Just give the tank a little bit of a once over. I can definitely tell you I need to get in there and clean out the filter intake. Everything looks like something that's been dragged up some of the depths of the bottom of a lake somewhere or something. Hasn't been seen in years. But there you go. So that needs to get cleaned out. Probably due for a water change. Get all those snail shells out of there, etc. Butterbean himself is doing well. He still has those white lesions to some degree, but they don't seem nearly as bad as they used to. So I'm going to stick with my, you know, keeping him below brackish and keeping him in less than brackish water. And that way, you know, we'll see what happens. I don't know. So that's about it. I can't think of anything else really to talk about with Butterbean's tank. Again, I just shot that video recently. If you want to check out my brackish tank playlist, there's tons of videos of him eating his snails and swimming around and doing his pufferfish thing. So there you go. Kept it under 35 minutes, which is where my camera cuts me off and makes me stitch two scenes together. So we will be able to do this all in one go. So there you are, everybody. We're back to where we started, sort of. Back at my 29 miscellaneous. Again, look at that. It's like a picture of perfection. It's my most stable tank. I never have issues with this tank. It just ticks over like a clock, and I don't do tons of water changes. It's got plastic gravel in it, and I don't put any food. I don't put any ferts. I don't put anything in there. Oh, we just hit my maximum file. It must be 33 minutes, not 35. So there you go. I'm going to have to stitch these two together anyway. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe. And don't forget, this one here is my 29 miscellaneous. So thanks again. I'll see you real soon in the next one.